Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking an impending and, frankly, deeply ironic economic whiplash that's about to hit South Africa. Over the past couple months, the government deployed a massive emergency tax subsidy, an absolute financial shield to protect consumers from soaring global energy costs. But, emergency relief can't last forever. That state subsidy is now beginning its structured unwinding, and it's creating a fascinating yet really painful shock at the gas pump. Our goal today is to map out exactly how this unwinding works, why it's happening right now, and how it's going to ripple through everything from your wallet to the national inflation rate.
We've got a lot of ground to cover. We're going to break this down into 5 parts. The R17.2 billion safety net, the June pump price shock, the supply chain ripple effect, inflation and interest rates, and finally, rethinking the fuel formula. Let's dive in.
Starting off with Part 1, the R17.2 billion safety net, and the emergency that kicked this whole thing off.
Think back to April 2026. The US-Iran conflict essentially shuts down the Strait of Hormuz. Now that is a massive, absolutely critical artery for global oil supply. This disruption forced the South African Treasury into rapid response mode. On April 1st, they introduced an emergency 3 rand per liter levy relief. But right now, we're hitting the hard exit deadlines. Phase 1 of this unwinding kicks in on June 3rd, and by July 1st, the full fuel levies are back. It's a really stark reminder of how global conflicts land directly on domestic doorsteps.
17.2 billion rand. That is a staggering amount of foregone tax revenue the state gave up across just 3 months to make that relief happen. And frankly, it's an impressive feat that the Treasury actually funded this neutrally. They balanced it out through higher tax collections and state underspending, but a temporary buffer is, well, just that, temporary.
Which brings us to Part 2, the June pump price shock and the return of the levies.
Okay, this is where the profound irony of the situation really hits you. If you look at the global market, underlying fuel costs are actually dropping right now. By all normal logic, motorists should be seeing roughly a 15-cent per liter decrease at the petrol pump, driven by a marginal under-recovery of between 11 and 19 cents. Basically, you should be getting a break. But because that R3 state tax relief is simultaneously being slashed in half to R1.50, that base-level market stability is totally overridden. Instead of saving 15 cents, motorists are going to pay significantly more.
Instead, boom, a projected R1.65 per litre increase for petrol. That is the stark reality households are going to absorb overnight starting June 3rd. And it's not just petrol either. Diesel, which had effectively carried a zero levy through May, is rocketing up by R1.97 per litre. So despite global prices actually cooling down, the return of domestic taxes creates an artificial spike at literally the worst possible time for consumers.
Moving right along to Part 3, the supply chain ripple effect.
Here's the thing we absolutely have to remember. Over 70% of goods in South Africa are transported by road. We're talking almost 3/4 of the entire economy moving on trucks. So when diesel and petrol go up by nearly 2 rand a liter overnight, it is definitely not an isolated event. There's a direct, immediate pass-through into the everyday cost of living. Every delivery truck, every logistics operator, every cold chain transport suddenly faces a massive spike in operational costs. And guess where those costs go? Yep, pass right down to the price tags on your local store shelves.
And honestly, nowhere is this strain more visible right now than in agriculture. Industry bodies like AgriSeya and AgBiz have been seriously sounding the alarm. They're dealing with partial fuel deliveries during critical operational periods, extreme global volatility, and sharply rising input costs. The real-world takeaway for all of us, these compounded pressures have already caused a projected 6% decline in upcoming wheat plantings for the 2026-2027 season. That actually brings wheat plantings to an alarming 12-year low. When farmers plant less wheat because fuel is just too expensive or too unreliable, the entire country eventually pays for it in food security.
So how does all this hit the broader economy? Let's look at Part 4, inflation and interest rates. When it costs this much more to move goods, the math gets pretty brutal. This sudden jump in transport and production costs is expected to add a full 0.6% directly to monthly inflation. That bump has the very real potential to push the overall consumer price index, the CPI, toward 4.2%. And whenever inflation creeps up like that, the central bank absolutely has to pay attention.
Now, put yourself in the shoes of the South African Reserve Bank right now. Talk about being stuck in an intense balancing act. They held the repo rate steady at 6.75% in March, specifically citing these exact supply-side risks. With inflation tracking toward that 4.2% mark, all eyes are on their upcoming May 28th meeting. While the current indicators suggest they're likely to keep rates unchanged, they face immense pressure to maintain a highly cautious stance. They are essentially trapped between a slowing economy on one side and rising fuel-driven inflationary pressures on the other.
Finally, let's wrap this up with Part 5, rethinking the fuel formula and the desperate need for structural reform.
Because ultimately, this whole situation boils down to a deep structural issue: the basic fuel price formula. Think of it as the regulatory engine used to calculate domestic pump prices. The problem? It relies heavily on reference markets that track Gulf supply routes. But as we saw with the Strait of Hormuz closure, those routes are deeply compromised. South Africa imports over 60% of its refined product, and the actual geography of where that product comes from today has fundamentally shifted away from those old pathways. Because of this massive disconnect, the Department of Mineral and Petroleum Resources is now urgently reviewing this outdated formula to reflect actual reality.
As critics from organizations like UDA and Top Auto have rightly pointed out, quote, "The formula review is the decision that will matter most when the subsidy is gone." And they hit the nail on the head there. While the government did successfully buffer the initial commodity shock this time around, critics are quick to remind us that similar reviews of this exact formula have stalled repeatedly since 2024. None of those past promises produced lasting reform, which dramatically raises the stakes for this particular intervention. The financial band-aid is being ripped off, but the underlying wound, it's still completely exposed.
As the R17.2 billion relief vanishes and the country's economic vulnerability is laid bare once again, we're left with one massive, lingering question. Is South Africa's fuel pricing architecture actually built for a world where the next geopolitical flashpoint is never more than one shipping choke point away? Will this urgent, forced review finally deliver the lasting structural reform the country has been promised since 2024, or is this just another temporary pause, leaving consumers bracing for the next inevitable shock? We'll definitely have to keep a close eye on the pumps this June to find out.